Hi, my name is Bella. When I say these words, I always feel like there are too many stories behind them and too little energy to tell them all. But if I'm going to start, I'll start with the simplest. I'm 32 years old, and for several years now I've been working as a software developer at a large tech company where they seem to appreciate my talent, pay well, and offer freedom. I work remotely, from my own home, which on the one hand sounds like a godsend, but on the other has turned into a real trap, because my family has decided that working from home means I can juggle everything and still look after the kids. I have retired parents and an older sister named Adelina, who is 37. She divorced about 2 years ago, and with it came a storm of change. 3 children, Alvise is 9, Christina is 7, and little Huberto is only 6. After her divorce, Adelina suddenly became determined to try her luck again, dating, and finding a new husband. As if this idea was keeping her afloat and preventing her from completely breaking down. But, as you can imagine, 3 small children isn't the kind of baggage that can easily be incorporated into a new romantic relationship. That's why she chose what she considered the most convenient path. She started bringing the children to me regularly. At first, it seemed like a temporary measure, just for a few hours when she had dates, and I readily agreed to help, because the children are cute, and it's hard for my sister. But time passed, and over the past year, the situation has spiraled out of control, so now I'm essentially raising my nephews and niece as if they were my own. Alvise, the eldest, calm and surprisingly sensible for his age, often helps me manage the younger ones, and to be honest, it's only thanks to him that I'm still holding on and not sliding into despair. But even with his support, the daily care of 3 restless children, combined with trying to hold down a full-time job, is an exhausting race in which I almost always come in last. Adelina lives in a rented apartment, receives a decent amount of alimony from her ex-husband, and works part-time at some marketing firm, maybe 20 hours a week, no more. As a senior developer, I earn a decent income and, on top of that, constantly help her financially. Our retired parents also contribute to the situation, regularly sending her money, as if to ensure her fragile existence. My typical day is like an endless sprint. I wake up at 6 in the morning to get to work while the kids are still asleep. An hour later, around 7, Adelina drops them off at my place on her way to work or on some other errand, and it's at that moment that my worries begin to multiply. I make breakfast, make sure everyone is dressed, get them ready for school, and, taking a breather, steal a few hours to code. But after school, it all starts again. I sit with each child over their homework, go over math and reading, explain anything they didn't understand, and I feel like a full-time teacher again. Then it's dinner time, and I cook for 4, feed them, bathe them, put them to bed, and only around 9 or 10 o'clock does the house finally quiet down. And only when their breathing becomes even do I sit down at the computer and begin my real workday, which lasts until midnight, and sometimes longer, because there's so much I don't have time to finish during the day. I've already missed several important project deadlines, and it's damaging my career, my reputation, and my self-esteem. But the worst part is that Adelina acts as if all this is self-evident. She never asks if it's convenient for me, doesn't inquire if I'm overloaded, simply assumes I'm obligated to take care of her children when she needs them. And recently, it turned out that everything is much more serious than I thought. Last Wednesday, right in the middle of my workday, she called around noon and, without even asking if I was busy, said urgently, "Bella, I need you to come to dinner with Mom and Dad this Saturday. I have something important to announce. The whole family needs to be there. Can't you tell me right now?" I blurted out that Wednesday, when she called in the middle of the workday, her voice full of hidden triumph, as if cutting off my option to refuse. "No," Adelina replied, pausing as if they were part of a carefully orchestrated scene. "It has to be in person. Believe me, you'll be interested to hear it." I had no idea what exactly she was about to announce, but I felt that strange feeling inside me that you get before unexpected changes, when you're worried, but your curiosity is stronger. I wondered if she'd finally found a serious man who could take on some of the childcare, and then maybe my life would return to some degree of normalcy. Honestly, that would be the best news I'd heard in months. Saturday arrived. and around 5 o'clock in the evening, I was already driving to my parents' house, running through all the possible important announcements in my head. When I pulled up to the house, I immediately noticed Adelina's car was already parked in the driveway, and another car, unfamiliar to me, was parked next to it, which immediately alerted me. Walking inside, I saw my sister with the children in the living room, along with a man I'd never met before. He looked about 30, of average height, slightly tense, as if unsure how to act. "Bella." Adelina jumped up, beaming, and hugged me so tightly, as if the endless grievances and omissions between us had never existed. "I'm so glad you came, meet David." The man stood up, extended his hand, and with a strained, polite smile said, "Nice to meet you. Adelina's told me a lot about you." "Nice to meet you too," I replied automatically, peering into his eyes, trying to discern the kind of man who would now be part of our family. At that moment, the parents emerged from the kitchen, and we all sat down to dinner. The children were unexpectedly calm, almost perfectly, and this should have been my first warning sign. If the little ones are obedient, it means the adults have something important planned. I tried to concentrate on eating, but the tension was mounting, and somewhere around the middle of dinner, I broke down. "Okay, Adelina," I said, putting down my fork, "what's this important announcement you've gathered us all to tell us?" She cleared her throat, took David's hand, and at that moment her face literally lit up, as if an inner lantern of happiness had ignited within her. "Well, hello everyone," she began, pausing dramatically. "David and I have some wonderful news to share with you," and with a smug smile, she added, "I'm pregnant, and David and I are getting married soon." The room was so silent I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. 5 seconds of silence, and suddenly the parents cried out with joy, jumped up from their chairs, rushed to hug Adelina, congratulate her, and burst into raptures. David, visibly embarrassed, still smiled and nodded in response to the congratulations. I sat there, transfixed, unable to believe my ears. Adelina was barely managing with the 3 children she already had, working only 20 hours a week and living on child support, while regularly relying on my help and her parents' money. How could a 4th child improve this situation? I couldn't find the logic, but the words burst from my lips. "Congratulations, wow, that's great news." "Thank you, Bella," my sister replied, smiling so easily and carefree that my insides went cold. "But actually, that's not all." She turned to me, and something flickered in her eyes that made my heart clench. "What else?" I asked, feeling myself tense. "I need you to take care of the children for a few months while I go through pregnancy and then recover from the birth." I nearly choked on my water, coughed, and stared at her as if I hadn't heard. "What? Temporarily?" "Well, yes," she answered matter-of-factly, "so I can focus on my health and not exhaust myself with worries. And then, after the baby is born, I'll need a little more time to adjust and get my life back on track." "Adelina," I barely kept my voice in check, "are you completely crazy?" Her smile instantly vanished, and she looked at me defiantly. "Excuse me? You expect me to raise your 3 children alone for months? On top of everything I already do for them?" "Bella," she drawled, as if I were a spoiled child, "there's nothing wrong with you helping your nephews and niece." "Helping?" I couldn't help but laugh mirthlessly. "I'm already raising them, Adelina. I feed them, check their homework, buy them clothes, pay for their clubs and entertainment. I carry it all on my own." I fell silent, my hands shaking, and suddenly realized the simple truth. I was exhausted. Adelina's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at me as if I had just betrayed her in the most cruel way. "I can't believe you're so selfish and greedy in this matter," she said, her voice shaking, her words laced with not only resentment but also condemnation, as if I'd broken some unwritten law of sisterly loyalty. I turned to my parents, expecting them to stop her, to tell her bluntly that she'd gone too far, that her request was absurd and unfair, but instead, my mother looked at me sternly and coldly, as if I was to blame for everything that was happening. "Bella, you don't have children of your own," she said firmly, as if settling the argument. "You don't understand how hard it is to raise them." I stared at her in stunned amazement, my head spinning. "I don't understand?" I repeated, feeling my indignation boiling within me. I've spent the last year constantly caring for Adelina's children, Mom. I know their every habit, their every fear, their every schoolwork. I put them to bed when Adelina was having fun, I cooked them breakfast and dinner, I sat with them when I had deadlines to meet, and you say I don't understand? That's different, my father interjected, trying to sound conciliatory, but his words sounded like a death sentence. Adelina needs our support now. What about my support? I blurted out, what about my work, my life, my health? Or does that not matter? Mom sighed and, as if giving a moralizing lecture, said, if Adelina wants to have another child, she should be able to do so without being criticized by her family. At that moment, I realized I couldn't sit at that table any longer. I stood up abruptly, pushing back my chair, and said, then let her do it without my help. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door, while behind me I heard Adelina's muffled cries and my parents' loud voices, shouting after me about family responsibilities and how I was betraying their trust. I got out, got in the car, and drove home furious, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. By the time I got home, my phone was blowing up with messages, each one like a knife. Adelina, you're a terrible sister, how can you be so selfish? Mom, Bella, you should be ashamed of yourself, it's your duty to help your family. Dad, Adelina needs support right now, not criticism, you're being unreasonable. I stared at the screen, literally shaking with anger and helplessness, but I didn't respond to a single message, because I knew any words would only escalate the conflict. I hoped they would calm down, think it over, and understand how ridiculous and insane Adelina's request was. Asking someone to care for 3 children for months while you get married and have a fourth was beyond reason. That evening, for the first time in months, I turned off my phone and went to bed early, and, strangely enough, I fell asleep almost immediately, without the usual thoughts about how much I hadn't accomplished. The following week turned out to be the calmest I'd had in the entire past year. Adelina never brought the children to see me again, my parents stopped calling and guilt-tripping, and a blessed silence reigned in the house, in which the only sounds were the hum of my keyboard and my own thoughts. I was finally able to fully immerse myself in work. I completed all my projects on time, and even exceeded expectations on some tasks. One day, my boss called and said he was going to give me a bonus for good work, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was managing, like I had control of my life again, like I wasn't just a cornered woman, but a professional with a future. But, as it turned out, this was only the calm before the storm. On Saturday morning, having slept in for the first time in months, I was awakened by a loud knock on the door. I glanced sleepily at the clock. It was only 7 in the morning. I went downstairs in my pajamas, looked through the peephole, and felt my heart sink. My 3 nephews were standing on the porch of my house, each carrying a suitcase. I immediately opened the door and gasped in disbelief, "What are you doing here?" They looked frightened and confused. Alvise held Christina's hand tightly, and little Huberto clutched a tattered teddy bear, as if it were his only protection. "Mom brought us here," Alvise said quietly, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered. "She put the suitcases by the door and told me to wait 5 minutes and then knock. She said you'd take care of us." I felt my blood pressure rise, like blood rushing in my ears. "She left you here alone?" "We weren't alone for long," Alvise answered quickly, "but we didn't know what to do. I brought the children into the house, sat them down on the couch, gave them each a glass of juice, and poured cereal into bowls, trying to speak softly and soothingly. Even though inside I was seething with rage and confusion, they ate silently, as if afraid to utter an unnecessary word, which only made me feel worse, because children shouldn't feel guilty for playing adult games. I immediately grabbed the phone and dialed Adelina's number, my heart pounding so loudly in my temples that I barely heard the long dial tone. Only after the 10th ring did she finally answer. "What?" Her voice sounded irritated, as if I'd interrupted something important. "Adelina, you left 3 children on the street, without adult supervision." I snapped, unable to contain myself. Anything could have happened to them. "Oh, please," she waved me off with a levity that made my insides clench. it's only 5 minutes, you would have taken them anyway. Are you completely crazy? I was about to scream, but she just sighed, as if I was boring her with my dramatics. Listen, Bella, she said in a calm, almost lazy tone, I know you'll give in and help me, you always do, and the kids need stability right now, so just accept it. Come and get them right now, I demanded, trying not to lose my temper. I can't, David and I have plans today, she replied coldly and hung up. I caught my breath, but forced myself to act. I called my parents immediately. Mom, I said, barely containing my trembling, Adelina just dropped the kids off on my porch and left. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then my mother's voice sounded tired and reproachful. Bella, your sister is trying to build a life with David, right now, she needs to focus on her relationship. What if we focus on her current children? I shouted into the phone, maybe we should remember that she already has 3 who need her care. You need to stop being so selfish and help your family, my mother snapped. I froze, disbelieving, and then hung up, feeling the ground slipping from under my feet. Before I could recover, 20 minutes later, there was another knock on the door. I opened the door. 2 police officers were standing on the threshold. Madam, one of them said, we've been informed that you plan to abandon 3 children. What? I recoiled as if I'd been struck. No, that's absolutely not true. The caller said you were planning to kick your nephews out of the house, the second officer clarified. I couldn't believe it, but it all became clear. It was Adelina, she had called the police on me. Gentlemen, officers, it was completely wrong. This morning, my sister brought the children here and left them on my porch, with their suitcases, unattended. Is that true? One of the officers leaned toward Alvise. The boy nodded gravely. Yes, Mom brought us here with our things, told us to wait until she left and only then knock on Aunt Bella's door. Actually, I said, remembering I had ironclad proof, I have security footage. I installed it 2 months ago. After several break-ins in the neighborhood, I didn't tell my family about it. Just a minute, I'll show you. I took out my phone, opened the archive, and showed the officers the video. The footage showed everything. Adelina lugging the suitcases, talking to the children, leaving, getting into the car, and driving away, leaving the little ones alone. This is absolutely clear evidence of child abandonment, one of the officers said, exchanging glances with his partner. I want to file a report, I said firmly, though inside I was shaking, and I want Child Protective Services to know about this. The police took detailed statements from me and the children, made a copy of the security footage, and assured me it would be included in the case file. Before leaving, one of them said, the children can stay with you for now, but CPS will be required to investigate this situation. The next day, a woman from Child Protective Services came to my house. Her name was Rita, and her voice was calm and firm, like someone used to dealing with the most difficult cases. She interviewed me first, then the children individually, asking questions about how often they stayed with me, what conditions they were provided, and where their mother was during this time. As I understand it, she said, leafing through papers and looking at me over her glasses, the children spend most of their time in your care? Unfortunately, yes, I answered Rita, trying to speak calmly, though my insides were clenching. Their mother regularly brings them to me when she's not home, and this happens almost every week. And you provide them with financial support? She asked, peering at me carefully over her glasses. Yes, I nodded. I buy them clothes, pay for extracurricular activities, school supplies, and sometimes even food, because the children themselves complain to me that there's often nothing to eat at home. My sister receives child support, but it doesn't seem to go toward child support. Rita took careful notes in her notebook, asking occasional clarifying questions, and then said in an even voice that they would open an official case to investigate Adelina's fitness to be a mother. That same evening, as I was about to put the children to bed, the door suddenly swung open without knocking, and Adelina burst into the house. Her face was flushed with anger, her hair was disheveled, her voice piercing with rage. You called CPS on me? Are you completely crazy? You left 3 children outside, I tried to speak firmly, though my hands were shaking. For 10 minutes without adult supervision. That's not just a mistake, Adelina, that's abandonment. Because of you, they'll take my children away, she screamed, stamping her foot. Maybe it would be better for everyone, I blurted out, and I could tell by the look in her eyes that I'd hit a nerve. Adelina's face flushed. I'm taking the children home now, she growled, striding toward the sofa where Alvise and Christina were sitting. No, you won't do that, I stopped her. The police and child protective services have made it clear the children will stay here until the situation is resolved. You can't keep them safe from me, she hissed. I'm not hiding them from you, Adelina, I replied wearily. You abandoned them yourself when you left them here like suitcases. She clenched her fists, turned sharply, and ran out of the house, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Half an hour later, the phone rang. It was my parents. Bella, you've ruined everything. Mom screamed, panic lacing her voice. Because of you, your sister's children could end up in foster care. Actually, Mom, I interrupted, their father called me yesterday. CPS contacted him and told him what happened. He wants custody. He's tired of paying Adelina child support while she abandons the children to other people. He's planning to sue her. There was silence on the other end of the line, and I could even hear Mom catching her breath. He'll stop paying child support and take full custody, I continued. Honestly, that sounds like the best outcome for the kids. The parents hung up silently, leaving me with this difficult but truthful confession. I turned and looked at the 3 little ones sitting in the living room, smiling as they watched a children's movie. For the first time in weeks, they looked truly calm and happy. The children stayed with me for the next month while the investigation continued and the trial began. Honestly, it was the most stable and orderly period they'd known in years. With Adelina no longer coming to pick them up unannounced, we developed a real routine. I worked in the mornings while they were at school, picked them up at 3 o'clock, helped them with their homework, made dinner, and then, after they went to bed, I'd get to work on my projects and finish everything I hadn't gotten around to during the day. Alvise began smiling more often. Christina stopped biting her nails out of anxiety, and little Huberto started playing with toys he'd barely touched before. They no longer lived in anticipation of their mother appearing or disappearing, no longer wondering where she was every weekend, but knowing exactly what to expect from each day. Their father, Nestor, called me regularly in the evenings to check on the children and discuss the details of the court case. Bella, I want you to know how grateful I am to you, he said one day during a call, his voice trembling. I had no idea Adelina was constantly dumping the kids on you. Has she been doing this for over a year? I'm so sorry, I've been paying her $2,500 a month in child support this whole time, thinking she genuinely cared about them, but from what I understand, most of that money went toward her dates and shopping. He sighed heavily. Well, that's all about to change. My attorney is confident we have compelling grounds for the court to grant me full custody. After the defendant's attorney made a brief closing and the courtroom filled with heavy anticipation, the judge, looking down at his notes, asked everyone present to remain silent and began asking questions that seemed to demand not only facts but also that very human honesty that is sometimes so lacking in legal disputes. I listened to his voice and thought of sleepless nights, of the children I'd cradled in my arms, of the routine I'd managed to create for them, and of how quickly this fragile world could crumble under the blows of other people's decisions. The prosecutor turned to me again, and I described my typical week in detail, not hiding my fatigue. I talked about feeding them in the mornings, buying warm clothes for the winter, constantly rushing anxiously to school meetings and corresponding with teachers, paying for clubs and bringing their diplomas to sections, because otherwise their world would become poorer and more vulnerable. Every time I said my voice betrayed not only fatigue, but also that quiet pride that comes from those who do not close their eyes when children need support. Adelina's lawyer tried to portray me as an interfering aunt, wanting to take the children away from their loving mother, but when the teachers came forward as witnesses, Mrs. Patterson, who confirmed that I was listed as an emergency contact, and 2 other teachers, talked about how I attended events, signed permission slips, picked up sick people, and discussed progress. Their story began to crack, and the truth, slowly twisting, seemed to take the form of order and attention, rather than irresponsible promises. The judge suddenly turned to my parents and asked why, knowing what was happening, they hadn't held their daughter accountable. At that moment, the pride of their defensive phrases about support and the opportunity to start a new life melted under the intense questioning of specific dates and facts. They fell silent, and that silence perhaps spoke louder than any excuse. Nestor stood up and said quietly, directly, and without pathos, "Your Honor, I want my children to be safe and in a stable environment." His words, simple and heavy, pierced me. I felt my heart simultaneously tighten and calm, because his request was what I myself wanted for these children, and his lawyer, shuffling through the documents, cautiously pointed out the regularity of child support payments and the fact that the funds didn't always go to the children's needs. When the judge left us for the jury room, the silence that fell was almost tangible. People rustled papers, someone sighed softly, and I, closing my eyes for a moment, thought about how if the decision favored their father and the children were granted custody, they would have a chance at the very stability I had tried to provide them. This realization was both frightening and somewhat relieving, but if the decision was different, we would all have to find new paths, and this risk hung over my head like a long, cold rain. The moment the court doors closed, Nestor leaned toward me and, almost in a whisper, said, "Bella, no matter how many decisions there are, thank you for everything you've done for them." There was no complaint in his voice, only weariness and gratitude. I nodded in response, at a loss for words, because words always seem too small compared to the burden we bore. The judge returned, announced he would issue a decision in a few days, and the hearing was adjourned. I stepped outside, where the chill evening air hit me in the face, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something shift inside. I was no longer just a tired woman caring for other people's children. I was now a participant in a case where children's lives were at stake, and this feeling, strangely intertwined with fear, simultaneously gave me strength and prepared me for the fight ahead. I knew the fight was just beginning, and I would not give up. The most compelling and perhaps irrefutable evidence was the CCTV footage, which the judge demanded be played twice, and each time his face changed. At first, he maintained his usual sternness and detachment, but then his gaze revealed something more than just formal attention, wariness, understanding, and, it seemed to me, indignation at what he had witnessed with his own eyes. Afterwards, as if to finally clarify the situation, Adelina's text messages were presented, the very ones in which she wrote to me, almost demandingly and without a shadow of a doubt, that I should take the children with me for a few months because she needed to concentrate on her new relationship, which she clearly prioritized above her duties as a mother and her obligations to her own children. I noticed the prosecutor, turning to the courtroom, pronounce loudly and clearly, "The defendant perceives childcare as something that can easily be outsourced to relatives while she pursues her own interests," and these words struck like a heavy hammer at the arguments of her lawyer, who had vainly tried to equate my many years of labor and constant care with ordinary family support. The judge, however, was adamant. He said there was a huge difference between occasional supervision, which is natural in any family, and the de facto abdication of responsibility, where the mother repeatedly shifted responsibilities to others. After 2 days of grueling and tense hearings, the judge retired to deliver his decision, and I walked outside with trembling hands, knowing that the future of the 3 children I had grown to love as if they were my own depended on these few sheets of paper to be signed. The week of waiting dragged on agonizingly slowly, each night like an endless internal debate between hope and fear, until finally we were gathered in the courtroom again. The judge announced the verdict, and his voice rang out to me almost like the ringing of a bell. Based on the evidence presented, the children are granted full custody to their father, Nestor Mitchell. At that moment, the courtroom came alive. Adelina covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. My parents looked shocked, as if they hadn't expected this outcome. Nestor smiled for the first time in a long time and quietly nodded to me, and I sat stony-faced, but inside, a storm of relief and sadness raged at the same time. The court ruled that the mother had systematically failed to provide the children with adequate stability, placing everything on the family's shoulders, and the abandonment of the children demonstrated a disturbing and dangerous recklessness. Child support payments cease, and the father assumes full financial responsibility, the judge added, and with that decision, everything was over. A few weeks later, Nestor moved the children into his new home, preparing separate bedrooms for them and arranging for them to attend good schools nearby. I visited them and saw the children running around the rooms, showing me their new beds, bookshelves, and toys, their faces beaming with joy at having a place to call home. To my dismay and surprise, the transition was easy. They had always loved their father and were delighted to finally experience the stability they had so longed for. They sometimes came to visit me on weekends, and one day, Alvise, snuggling close to me, said he felt much happier now because he no longer had to worry about where he'd spend the night. Meanwhile, Adelina married David, a modest ceremony without me, and I took it calmly, because there was no longer any room for formal pleasantries between us. A few months later, she gave birth to a fourth child, as if starting from scratch, but this no longer applied to my nephews. After the trial, my parents stopped speaking to me, accusing me of destroying Adelina's family. Even though I knew and felt with every fiber of my being that I wasn't destroying it, I was protecting the children. And that was what mattered most. Their condemnation hurt, but it couldn't erase the peace I saw in the children's eyes. 6 months passed, and my life had changed almost beyond recognition. For the first time since Adelina's divorce, I could afford to live just for myself, work without unexpected calls, sleep in on weekends, and make plans without worrying about having to give everything up at any moment for the kids. My career took off, and I was promoted to senior engineering manager, bringing with it a raise and the opportunity to work on cutting-edge AI projects. I even started dating again. I met Ryan, a software engineer, at a conference, and when I told him the whole story, he shook his head and said, "You raised 3 kids who weren't yours while working full-time, that's incredible." I replied that I didn't know how single parents cope, since most don't have high-paying jobs or relatives who could leverage their labor the way Adelina did. Ryan was right. I'd accepted the abnormal as normal for too long, and only now did I realize the cost of my life. Meanwhile, the children flourished under their father's care. Alvise delved into math and rejoiced at his successes. Christina sang in the school choir. I heard her clear voice at a concert and almost burst into tears. And little Uberto ran proudly around the baseball field, demonstrating his first successes. They came to visit me every other weekend. And now our time spent together felt less like a duty and obligation and more like a genuine joy, and this was perhaps the most wonderful reward. After everything we'd been through, instead of feeling like an exhausted caretaker, unable to keep up with school schedules, work schedules, and her own thoughts, I suddenly realized that I could now spend time with the children with genuine joy and ease, not out of a sense of duty, but because I wanted to. We went to the movies together, laughed at simple comedies, wandered through museums where Christina would linger delightedly over the paintings and ask questions about everything, or simply stayed at my house and, contrary to my own expectations, played video games, where Alvise taught me to press the buttons faster, and little Uberto laughed at my clumsy control of the characters. One day, during their visit, Alvise looked at me seriously and asked, "And, Aunt Bella, are you happier now? You look calmer, as if you're resting, and you no longer look perpetually tired." I smiled, trying not to cry, and said that yes, I did feel happier. "And are you happy living with your dad?" I asked. "Aha." Christina immediately interjected, waving her arms excitedly. "Dad cooks dinner every night, helps us with our homework, and we don't have to worry about where we'll sleep." And at that moment, I realized that the decision to change custody was the right one for all of us. News about Adelina, however, was completely different. I learned from distant relatives that her marriage to David had been difficult, and caring for a newborn was much harder than she'd imagined, especially without the usual option of leaving the older children to me or other loved ones. She had to get a full-time job because child support payments had stopped, and David, with his sales job, wasn't earning enough to provide for the family. My cousin Lisa once told me that Adelina had asked several relatives for money, complaining that she couldn't buy baby food and diapers, but many already knew the truth and didn't want to get involved anymore. My parents remained furious and almost completely cut off contact with me, which, frankly, was a relief. I was tired of living with the constant feeling of guilt, hearing accusations of selfishness every time I said even the most basic boundaries. The rest of our family eventually came to terms with it. My cousin Mark called me a few months after the trial and said, "Bella, I want to apologize. We all knew Adelina was taking advantage of your kindness, but no one wanted to get into a fight. I appreciate what you did, it was very brave. The children are truly in a better place now. And maybe this is the lesson Adelina needed. Raising your own child is completely different. Maybe now she'll learn a thing or two." A year after the trial, something I'd only dreamed of happened in my life. I bought my first house, 3 bedrooms, a spacious office, a large yard with enough space for flowers and patio furniture. I invited Nestor and the kids to the housewarming party, and when they arrived, laughter was everywhere. The children were running around the rooms and the backyard, and Christina, choking with delight, exclaimed, "Aunt Bella, this place is amazing." I hugged her and said, "Thank you, dear, you'll always have your own rooms here whenever you come visit." While the kids were examining every detail, Nestor pulled me aside and, looking me straight in the eye, said, "Bella, I can never fully repay you for everything you've done. I understand it cost you your relationship with your parents and sister, but you know, those relationships were already painful. I think you're better off without all that drama. The kids are doing well now. Alvise received an honorable mention last semester. Christina's teacher says she's one of the brightest students in the class, and little Huberto is growing up cheerful and confident. They are wonderful children, they just needed stability. First you gave it to them, and now I'm giving it to them. You saved them from years of chaos." I listened to him and realized he was right. Looking back, I clearly saw that the moment I first said no to Adelina, I made the most important decision of my life, not only for the children, but also for myself. For years, I allowed her irresponsibility to ruin my health and my life because I was afraid of arguments and felt obligated. But there came a point when I realized that being a good sister or daughter doesn't mean submitting to other people's whims, it means being able to protect and say no when necessary. Adelina had grown accustomed to treating me like an unpaid babysitter because I never set clear boundaries myself, and she had practically abandoned her children to me. But there came a point when I realized I had to choose between supporting someone else's dysfunction and protecting innocent lives. These children deserved more than being a burden to their mother. They deserved a parent who truly wanted to raise them, and now they had that, and I finally had my life. I was proud of my choice. Yes, it had cost me some relationships, and I knew some would never forgive me for it, but I had learned that living an honest life and standing up for what's right is worth far more than the false approval bought at the cost of humiliation and guilt. Now I was free to build my life the way I wanted, and that was better than any forgiveness or recognition.